All right. We're now going to move away from some of the kind of deeper philosophical questions having to do with death that we've been looking at so far and focus on something a little bit more practical. Still with some, significant philosophical issues and philosophical content that we're going to get into a little bit later. But we're going to be focused on a sort of very specific issue in medicine, which is how physicians and sort of medical providers ought to define death. So what we're looking for and what our goal here is going to be is to try to figure out what definition of death works best for medicine. Because keep in mind, there are a lot of ways that we might define death, right? Just generally speaking. We might just say that a person is dead when they're not alive. I mean, that's true, right? In fact, that's kind of that's really hitting on the concept. In the past, death was defined as when a body is cold and motionless, right? Well, that also sort of gets at when a person is dead. We know for sure that a person who is cold and not moving, and maybe sort of where rigor mortis is set in as well, we know that person's dead. There's no question that that person's dead. We also have the more theological conceptions defining death in terms of when the soul leaves the body. That's the sort of official. It's for some time now. Peter Singer talks about this. That's been the official definition of death endorsed by the Catholic Church, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the Singer piece. Or you might, define death as the permanent cessation of all vital function, where vital function is just defined as all function that is necessary for life. Now, those are all interesting, slightly different definitions, and they're all sort of capturing something important about what death actually is, but they're not necessarily good medical definitions of death. For example, suppose we just use the definition that, well, a person is dead when they're not alive. Does that help a physician know whether the person lying on the table in front of them is alive or dead? It really doesn't. And you can say something similar about definitions like when the soul leaves the body, because medically and scientifically speaking, we're not really sure when that would occur. We don't sort of have instruments that detect that. Permanent cessation of all vital function. Well, for that to be useful, we have to already know which functions are the vital ones. There's some vital functions essential for life that can sort of stop working. People can cease to have them and still survive, because we can sort of replace them with various kinds of technological or pharmaceutical fixes. So the point here is just that while there are a lot of ways we can define death that seem to get it right, like they capture something important about when a person is dead, we need to think more about what sort of definition would be useful in medicine if we're going to come up with a medical definition of death. And what we want to look at is what I would describe as standards for a medical definition of death. I think it's sort of widely held, and we'll talk about why this is true as we work through this. Two standards that a medical definition of death would have to meet. One is that it would have to be quantifiable, so it would have to have kind of a numerical component. It would have to be something we could evaluate in that way. It can't be qualitative. And it would have to be measurable. It would have to be something that is available for evaluation or assessment. It can't be something like when the soul leaves the body. That isn't quantifiable, and it's not measurable either. So even if that is the correct or best definition of death, it doesn't mean it's not useful for medicine. The standard for a medical definition of death also has to be medically relevant and scientifically grounded, right? Medicine is committed to a particular view of the world, a particular picture of what reality is like, and so it's not going to allow for certain concepts to play a role in a medical definition of death. That's outside the scope of what medicine is committed to. So some of the definitions of death we might hear or find sort of interesting, even if they were right, they wouldn't be the sorts of definitions that a physician can utilize. The last thing we want to talk about here in this clip is why this is important. So why does it matter whether physicians have sort of an accurate, usable definition of death? They need to be able to tell whether their patients are alive, because living patients have certain rights, particularly a right to receive certain levels and types of treatment under certain conditions. In emergency care, when a patient comes in, if they're still alive, the physician is obligated to do what they can to try to save that person. If the person arrives and they are already dead, the physician does not have those same obligations. So it's important for physicians to be able to tell somewhat accurately and quickly whether or not a particular person is dead, because if they get it wrong too often, they're going to risk failing certain important moral and legal obligations that they have. So that's one reason why this is important. The other reason this is important is because of something called the dead donor rule. Now, this rule says that when we take organs for transplant, they can only be taken from a patient who is dead. If we take organs from a patient who is not dead, the thought is that, well, in that case, what actually kills the patient is the taking of the organs. And medicine, we seem to think, and I think this is plausible, should not be in the business of killing. There's sort of room for debate about that. It has to do with other issues that don't come up in this course, but generally speaking, that's sort of the basis of the dead donor rule, is that, look, if we don't want to kill patients for the sake of taking their organs, which is a sort of creepy Frankenstein quality to it, in addition to being sort of medically problematic, we need to have this rule that says you can only take organs from patients who are dead. All right, so those are kind of the two reasons that this is important. That's what your first question is going to be about, so go ahead and complete that question and then move on to the next clip, where we'll talk a little bit about Singer's analysis of how we shifted from cardiopulmonary standards to a more brain-based standard.